9 husbands, endless diamonds, and a spotlight that never dimmed, yet it still wasn't enough to save her. Zsa Zsa Gabor turned glamour into a weapon and scandal into an art form, dazzling Hollywood for decades. But behind the laughter, luxury, and outrageous headlines was a life spiraling toward isolation and decline. This is the dramatic downfall of the socialite who could never escape the glare of fame. Zsa Zsa Gabor emerged from a world steeped in old European elegance, ambition, and performance. Raised by a fiercely driven mother who believed beauty and visibility were passports to power, Zsa Zsa was groomed from an early age to stand out. Her poise, accent, and unapologetic confidence were not accidents. They were carefully cultivated traits that would later become her signature. When she won the Miss Hungary beauty contest in 1936, it marked the first public validation of a destiny built on glamour and attention. Her move to the United States transformed her from a European beauty queen into a full-fledged Hollywood phenomenon. By the 1940s and 1950s, Zsa Zsa had become synonymous with luxury, wit, and excess. Though often underestimated as just a socialite, she appeared in more than 70 films, including Moulin Rouge, Lily, Touch of Evil, and Queen of Outer Space. While her acting roles were rarely critically celebrated, her screen presence was undeniable. She radiated star power in an era that prized mystique and femininity above all else. Yet it was her off-screen life that truly cemented her legend. Zsa Zsa mastered the art of celebrity long before it became a science. She dominated society columns, talk shows, and gossip pages with ease, delivering sharp one-liners in her unmistakable accent and presenting herself as a living symbol of indulgence. She famously blurred the line between actress and icon, understanding instinctively that attention itself was a currency. Her appearances on television talk shows often overshadowed her film work, as audiences were drawn to her humor, self-awareness, and playful defiance of Hollywood norms. High society embraced her fully. Zsa Zsa moved effortlessly through elite circles, attending lavish parties, mingling with royalty, politicians, and moguls, and becoming a fixture in Beverly Hills and European aristocratic salons alike. Her numerous high-profile marriages, each to powerful, wealthy, or influential men, only fueled her image as a woman who lived boldly and without apology. To the public, she embodied a fantasy: beauty without restraint, luxury without guilt, and fame pursued as an end in itself. However, beneath the diamonds, gowns, and laughter, the relentless pursuit of glamour laid the groundwork for deeper personal instability. The pressure to remain eternally desirable, adored, and talked about became both her strength and her curse. While the world saw confidence and excess, cracks slowly formed behind the carefully curated persona. The same spotlight that elevated her to legendary status would later magnify her struggles, controversies, and emotional isolation. Zsa Zsa Gabor's early stardom was not merely the rise of an actress, it was the creation of a cultural archetype. She helped define what it meant to be famous for being famous, decades before the modern celebrity era. Her glamorous ascent through Hollywood and high society built an unforgettable legend, but it also set in motion the personal unraveling that would shadow her later years, proving that even the brightest icons can be undone by the very light that made them shine. Rather than finding emotional security behind the glittering facade of fame, Zsa Zsa Gabor's personal life unfolded as a near-constant cycle of romance, rupture, and reinvention. Over the course of her life, she married 9 times, each union arriving with public spectacle and ending in disappointment. What might have appeared glamorous from the outside often masked deep instability, unmet emotional needs, and an ongoing search for validation that fame alone could not satisfy. Her most notorious marriage was to Conrad Hilton, the powerful and much older hotel magnate. The relationship was volatile almost from the start, defined by control, emotional distance, and growing resentment. Zsa Zsa later accused Hilton of cruelty and abuse, claims that shocked polite society and fueled tabloid frenzy. Their divorce was bitter and humiliating, leaving her emotionally shaken and publicly scrutinized. Although the marriage elevated her status within elite circles, it failed to offer the security she had hoped for, reinforcing a painful pattern that would repeat itself. Equally infamous was her marriage to British actor George Sanders, a union marked by sharp intellects, bruised egos, and relentless tension. Sanders, known for his acerbic wit and emotional detachment, proved incompatible with Zsa Zsa's need for attention and affirmation. The marriage collapsed, but the fallout was unusually cruel. Sanders later married Magda Gabor, Zsa Zsa's sister, in what was widely interpreted as an act of deliberate spite. The betrayal fractured family relationships and intensified Zsa Zsa's sense of emotional isolation, turning private heartbreak into public spectacle. Her remaining marriages followed a similar trajectory. She wed oil tycoons, lawyers, businessmen, and controversial figures, men with wealth, influence, or notoriety, but rarely emotional availability. These relationships often seemed transactional, driven by status, mutual ambition, or the promise of stability rather than genuine compatibility. Each new husband was presented as a fresh chapter, a reinvention, a chance at permanence. Yet time and again, the marriages unraveled under the weight of clashing personalities, power struggles, and unresolved emotional wounds. Publicity followed her relentlessly. Every wedding, divorce, and courtroom dispute became fodder for headlines, reinforcing her image as both a romantic ideal and a cautionary tale. Zsa Zsa herself leaned into the drama, famously joking about marriage and men, using humor as both shield and weapon. Yet beneath the jokes was a woman who repeatedly sought love in environments ill-suited to sustaining it. As the years passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Each failed marriage left her more guarded, more defensive, and more reliant on the persona she had built. What the world saw as flamboyance increasingly functioned as armor. The constant upheaval eroded trust, not only in others, but in the idea that stability was possible at all. Zsa Zsa Gabor's string of marriages was not simply a series of romantic missteps, it was a reflection of a deeper emotional struggle. Raised to believe that beauty and attention were survival tools, she chased connection through alliances that prioritized image over intimacy. By the late 20th century, Zsa Zsa Gabor's carefully maintained image of glamorous excess began to collide with a far harsher reality. The wit and provocation that once fueled her celebrity increasingly drew her into public legal battles, exposing fractures not only in her relationships with outsiders, but within her own family. What had once been playful notoriety hardened into real-world conflict, played out in courtrooms rather than cocktail parties. In the 1990s, Gabor became embroiled in a defamation lawsuit filed by actress Elizabeth Montgomery, best known for Bewitched. The dispute stemmed from disparaging remarks Gabor allegedly made about Montgomery, remarks that crossed the line from celebrity banter into reputational harm. The lawsuit stunned Hollywood, in part because it involved two women whose public personas had been so different: Montgomery, discreet and private; Gabor, flamboyant and unapologetically outspoken. The case underscored how Zsa Zsa's lifelong habit of saying whatever came to mind, once celebrated as fearless honesty, now carried tangible legal consequences. This legal clash also marked a turning point in public perception. For decades, Gabor had survived scandals by leaning into humor, turning controversy into entertainment. But as the industry and audience sensibilities shifted, her comments were no longer dismissed as harmless eccentricity. Instead, they were scrutinized, litigated, and judged by standards that left little room for her old-world theatricality. The episode revealed how isolated she had become from the Hollywood system that once indulged her excesses. Even more painful and consequential was the legal warfare that erupted within her own family. In 2005, Zsa Zsa and her ninth husband, Prince Frederick von Anhalt, filed a lawsuit against her only child, Francesca Hilton. The suit accused Francesca of fraud and larceny, alleging that she had improperly obtained loans using Gabor's property as collateral without authorization. The spectacle of a mother suing her daughter shocked the public and cemented the narrative of irreversible family breakdown. The conflict with Francesca was layered with decades of unresolved resentment, emotional distance, and competing claims of loyalty and exploitation. Francesca, the daughter of Zsa Zsa's troubled marriage to Conrad Hilton, had long described a childhood marked by neglect and instability. From her perspective, the lawsuit represented not justice, but betrayal. For Zsa Zsa, however, the legal action was framed as self-defense, an attempt to regain control over her finances and autonomy as her health declined. The involvement of Prince Frederick only deepened public suspicion. A controversial figure himself, he was often portrayed as manipulative and opportunistic, leading critics to question whether Zsa Zsa was being protected or influenced. Regardless of motive, the lawsuit laid bare the emotional devastation beneath the glamorous myth, transforming private pain into public spectacle once again. These legal battles symbolized the final unraveling of Zsa Zsa Gabor's personal world. Fame had once shielded her from consequences, now it amplified them. Friends faded, family bonds disintegrated, and the laughter that once followed her scandals gave way to discomfort and sorrow. In the end, her courtroom dramas revealed what decades of parties and punchlines had concealed. A woman increasingly isolated, fighting not just for assets or reputation, but for control over a life that had slipped beyond her grasp. By 2002, the carefully cultivated image of Zsa Zsa Gabor as an ageless symbol of glamour could no longer shield her from the physical realities of aging. At 85 years old, her life took a devastating turn when she was involved in a serious car accident that would permanently alter the remainder of her years. The crash marked the true beginning of her physical decline, ending the mobility and independence that had defined even her later decades and forcing her into a far more fragile existence. The injuries she sustained were severe. The accident left Gabor partially paralyzed, significantly impairing her ability to walk and perform daily tasks without assistance. Once known for commanding rooms with effortless presence, she was suddenly dependent on caregivers and confined to a wheelchair for the rest of her life. The abrupt loss of physical autonomy was profound, especially for a woman who had built her identity around beauty, movement, and control over her own image. The contrast was cruelly symbolic. Zsa Zsa had once glided through ballrooms, film sets, and international society events draped in couture and jewels, her voice and posture projecting authority and allure. Now, simple activities, standing, traveling, even appearing in public, became exhausting and medically risky. The world that had once celebrated her visibility now saw her largely from behind closed doors, her appearances growing rare and carefully managed. Emotionally, the accident triggered a deep sense of confinement that extended beyond the physical. Accustomed to constant stimulation, attention, and movement, Gabor struggled with the sudden stillness of her new reality. Her world narrowed to medical appointments, private residences, and long periods of isolation, while her husband, Prince Frederick von Anhalt, assumed the role of caretaker and public spokesperson. Questions persisted about how much control she retained over her own affairs as her health deteriorated. The car accident also initiated a cascade of medical complications. Reduced mobility led to circulation issues, chronic pain, and increased vulnerability to infections. Each new health setback further diminished her strength, reinforcing a cycle of dependence that she had spent her entire life resisting. The vibrant persona she once projected began to exist more as memory than lived reality. Yet even in decline, Zsa Zsa remained a figure of fascination. Media outlets continued to frame her condition as a tragic contrast to her legendary past, often emphasizing the irony of a woman who had so openly celebrated beauty and vitality now confronting frailty so publicly. For admirers, the accident marked the moment when the fantasy finally cracked, revealing the human cost beneath decades of spectacle. The 2002 car accident was not merely an injury. It was a turning point that reshaped every aspect of Zsa Zsa Gabor's existence. It signaled the end of her life as a public participant and the beginning of a prolonged struggle defined by physical limitation, medical intervention, and loss of independence. For a woman who had lived unapologetically in motion, the forced stillness became the most difficult transformation of all, setting the stage for the long and painful final chapter of her extraordinary life. Between 2005 and 2010, Zsa Zsa Gabor's physical condition deteriorated at an accelerating pace, transforming what had already been a fragile existence into a near-constant medical struggle. The injuries and illnesses she endured during this period compounded one another, each event weakening her body further and eroding whatever independence remained after her earlier paralysis. What had once been a gradual decline became an unrelenting cycle of crisis and recovery, with diminishing returns each time. In 2005, Gabor suffered a stroke, a devastating blow for a woman already living with severe mobility limitations. The stroke affected not only her physical coordination, but also her energy, stamina, and ability to communicate clearly for extended periods. Tasks that had remained manageable with assistance, sitting upright for long stretches, engaging in conversation, or participating in decision-making, became increasingly difficult. The stroke deepened her reliance on caregivers and medical professionals, marking a turning point from assisted living to near-total dependence. The emotional impact was equally profound. Zsa Zsa had always defined herself by her voice, her sharp humor, and her commanding presence. After the stroke, even speaking could be exhausting, and her once effortless wit emerged only in brief flashes. Friends who visited found her quieter, more withdrawn, and visibly frustrated by the limits imposed on her body. The gap between the woman she remembered herself as and the one reflected back by illness grew wider with each passing year. In July 2010, tragedy struck again when Gabor fell and broke her hip, an injury especially dangerous for someone of her age and condition. Emergency surgery followed, along with extended hospital stays that exposed her to further complications, including infections and respiratory issues. Recovery was slow and incomplete. The injury robbed her of what little physical stability she retained and made even assisted movement risky. Standing, transferring, or repositioning her body now required multiple caregivers and meticulous planning. The hip fracture also intensified her isolation. Long hospitalizations disrupted any remaining routines and further distanced her from the outside world. Visits became shorter and less frequent as her condition made sustained interaction difficult. Medical equipment increasingly surrounded her, monitors, tubes, and mobility aids replacing the luxurious surroundings that once defined her life. The opulence of her past stood in stark contrast to the clinical reality of her present. Each medical event compounded the last, leaving her body with fewer reserves to draw upon. The stroke weakened her neurological function. The hip injury undermined her structural stability. Together, they left her vulnerable to cascading complications. By the end of the decade, Zsa Zsa Gabor was almost entirely confined to her bed or wheelchair, dependent on round-the-clock care and shielded from public view. By 2011, Zsa Zsa Gabor's long struggle with declining health reached its most harrowing stage. Years of immobility, weakened circulation, and repeated hospitalizations had left her body dangerously vulnerable. And in January of that year, doctors were forced to make a life-saving but devastating decision. Surgeons amputated most of her right leg above the knee after a gangrenous infection developed, the result of severe complications that her already fragile system could no longer fight. The amputation marked a grim turning point. What little physical autonomy Gabor retained was effectively erased, replacing hope of recovery with a stark focus on survival. The procedure was traumatic not only physically but psychologically. For a woman whose identity had long been intertwined with beauty, movement, and visibility, the loss of her leg symbolized the final collapse of the body that had once carried her effortlessly through film sets, ballrooms, and international society events. The glamour that had defined her public image now stood in painful contrast to the clinical reality of her existence. Recovery from the surgery was slow and fraught with complications. Gabor's advanced age and weakened immune system made healing difficult, and she remained hospitalized for extended periods. The amputation increased her susceptibility to infections, blood clots, and respiratory problems, all of which required constant medical monitoring. Even minor setbacks carried serious risk, reinforcing a cycle in which stabilization was often followed by sudden decline. That same year, her condition worsened further due to repeated infections and complications related to her feeding tube. Already unable to eat normally, Gabor relied on assisted nutrition, but the feeding tube itself became a source of recurring medical emergencies. Infections, blockages, and inflammation led to multiple hospital admissions, each one further draining her strength. The pattern became painfully familiar. Discharge, brief stabilization at home, and rapid return to the hospital as new complications emerged. These repeated crises underscored how completely her life had narrowed to medical intervention and survival. Decisions about her care increasingly fell to doctors and family members, as Gabor herself was often too weak to participate meaningfully. The once commanding voice that had filled talk shows and dinner parties was now heard only in fleeting moments, softened by exhaustion and pain. Public appearances were no longer possible, and even private visits became rare. Her world contracted to a hospital bed or carefully managed home environment surrounded by machines, caregivers, and medications. While headlines continued to reference her legendary past, the woman herself lived far removed from fame, enduring a relentless sequence of procedures and recoveries that offered little relief and no true restoration. From 2011 until her death in 2016, Zsa Zsa Gabor's life entered its most tragic and silent chapter, defined by profound cognitive decline and near-total isolation. The woman who had once thrived on attention, conversation, and spectacle gradually disappeared behind the walls of her Beverly Hills mansion, her legendary voice and personality overtaken by the relentless progression of chronic dementia and the cumulative damage of years of illness. As her condition worsened, dementia stripped away not only her memory, but her sense of identity. Those close to her reported that she no longer recognized familiar faces, struggled to comprehend where she was, and eventually lost awareness of her own fame. For a figure who had built her entire existence around being seen, remembered, and admired, the loss was devastating in its irony. The past, film sets, red carpets, witty talk show appearances, ceased to exist for her, erased by a mind no longer capable of anchoring memory to meaning. Physically, her condition was equally dire. By this stage, Gabor was entirely dependent on life support, sustained by feeding tubes and constant medical supervision. She was reportedly unable to speak, see, hear, or write, her sensory world narrowing to almost nothing. Communication became impossible, leaving caregivers and loved ones to interpret her needs through subtle movements or expressions, when any remained at all. The vibrant wit that once defined her public image vanished, replaced by long stretches of silence. Her isolation deepened as visits became rare and carefully controlled. Friends from her glamorous past faded away, either unable or unwilling to confront the painful transformation. Even family ties remained strained, shaped by years of legal disputes and emotional distance. While her husband, Prince Frederick von Anhalt, acted as her primary guardian and spokesperson, critics questioned whether she was being protected or hidden from view. Descriptions circulated that she was effectively locked away in her mansion, physically present in luxury, yet utterly removed from the life that luxury once symbolized. The contrast was stark and heartbreaking. Zsa Zsa Gabor had once embodied visibility itself, her beauty scrutinized, her marriages debated, her words endlessly quoted. In her final years, she existed almost entirely unseen, known to the public only through second-hand updates about her deteriorating condition. The world continued to speak about her, but she could no longer respond, recognize, or participate. Dementia did what scandal, aging, and controversy never could. It erased the persona she had so carefully constructed. Without memory, fame lost its meaning. Without awareness, glamour became irrelevant. What remained was a fragile human being, sustained by machines and caregivers, disconnected from the identity that had once made her extraordinary. In 2015, as Zsa Zsa Gabor was already living in a state of profound physical and cognitive decline, she suffered one final devastating loss: the death of her only child, Francesca Hilton, at the age of 67. The passing of her daughter marked a tragic closing of a lifelong, deeply complicated relationship, one shaped by love, resentment, estrangement, and unresolved pain. It was a blow that, under ordinary circumstances, might have shattered a mother emotionally. In Gabor's condition, it instead arrived as a quiet, sorrowful punctuation to a life already fading from awareness. The bond between Zsa Zsa and Francesca had long been fraught. Francesca, born from Gabor's turbulent marriage to Conrad Hilton, grew up largely removed from the glamorous world her mother inhabited. She later described a childhood marked by emotional distance, instability, and neglect, often overshadowed by her mother's relentless pursuit of fame, romance, and reinvention. As Zsa Zsa moved through marriages and scandals, Francesca remained on the periphery, never fully integrated into her mother's public life. In adulthood, the fracture deepened. Legal disputes erupted, most notably the highly publicized lawsuits in which Gabor and her husband accused Francesca of financial wrongdoing involving property loans. These conflicts hardened into estrangement, turning a strained relationship into an openly adversarial one. Public sympathy often shifted toward Francesca, who portrayed herself as a daughter abandoned emotionally and later cut off financially. For Zsa Zsa, the disputes reflected paranoia, fear of exploitation, and a desperate need for control as her health deteriorated. By the time Francesca Hilton died in January 2015, Zsa Zsa's ability to fully comprehend the loss was tragically uncertain. Suffering from advanced dementia, unable to communicate and reliant on life support, she reportedly no longer recognized people or grasped the significance of events around her. Whether she truly understood that her daughter was gone remains unclear, adding another layer of sorrow to an already heartbreaking moment. The possibility that mother and child never reconciled, never spoke honestly, never healed, haunts the narrative of both their lives. Symbolically, Francesca's death felt like the extinguishing of Zsa Zsa Gabor's last living link to continuity and legacy. With her only child gone, there would be no familial bridge between the myth of Zsa Zsa and the future. The famous name, the dramatic life, the endless headlines would outlive her. But not through bloodline or reconciliation, only through memory and media. For observers, the timing was especially cruel. Francesca died while her mother was still alive but no longer truly present, leaving the story unresolved, unfinished, and deeply tragic. It mirrored Zsa Zsa's own fading existence, once vibrant, now silent, once central, now removed. On December 18, 2016, Zsa Zsa Gabor died at the age of 99, bringing to a close one of the most flamboyant and paradoxical lives Hollywood had ever produced. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest, with coronary artery disease and cerebrovascular disease listed as contributing factors, conditions that reflected years of physical deterioration following decades of injury, illness, and medical intervention. Her death, though widely reported, arrived without the spectacle that had once followed every chapter of her life. By then, she had been sustained on life support for years, her passing serving less as a shock than as the quiet conclusion of a long medical ordeal. For much of the public, Zsa Zsa's death felt symbolic rather than immediate. The woman who had once dominated headlines with her beauty, wit, and scandal had effectively vanished from public life long before her heart finally failed. Confined, silent, and disconnected by dementia and frailty, she had already slipped beyond the reach of the celebrity culture she helped invent. Her death merely formalized what illness had been steadily doing for more than a decade, closing the final curtain on a legend who had outlived her own era. Her funeral service in Beverly Hills drew a small but notable gathering, reflecting both her enduring fame and the narrowing of her personal world. Tributes acknowledged her unmistakable presence, her sharp tongue, and her unapologetic embrace of excess. Yet the tone was subdued, shaped by the awareness that her final years had been defined not by glamour, but by profound suffering and isolation. The ceremony felt less like a celebration of a star than a farewell to a woman who had carried the weight of notoriety for nearly a century. In accordance with her wishes, Gabor's remains were later moved to Hungary, returning her to the country of her birth. The gesture closed a long circle, from Budapest to Hollywood and back again, uniting the European origins she never fully abandoned with the American fame that reshaped her identity. It was a final assertion of control over her narrative, even after a prolonged period in which illness had stripped that control away. What do you think about Zsa Zsa Gabor? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this, and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.